chairman of our board of trustees, Dr. Harris, who is responsible for organizing this panel. Robbie is also a retired naval captain, so that gives us at least 5 in the room. I know there's only one vice admiral here. Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Frank. Okay, well, I guess I will take some responsibility for tonight's topic and tonight's panel. The topic is piracy. It is topical. It's not quite as topical as it was in November when we first organized this panel to talk about this subject in front of another group down in Washington. And I think the 3 panel members will have something to say tonight about why we don't hear quite as much about piracy today as we did back in November. I don't think I need to speak to you about the importance of piracy. We thought it was over and gone with. It's back. It has an impact on trade. It has an impact on the economy. It has impact, or potential impact, on the energy market. And of course, there's a relationship with terrorists of one form or another. We have 3 distinguished panel members who will come at the topic from 3 somewhat different perspectives. Dr. Martin Murphy from the CSBA, one of the prominent think tanks down in Washington, will give you the perspective of an academic, of a scholar. And there's probably none who have studied more, written more, published more on the topic of maritime irregular warfare and piracy than Dr. Murphy. So he'll give you the perspective from a scholar. Secondly, we have 2 practitioners. One, Captain Sam Neill from the U.S. Coast Guard, and he is the head of the strategic planning shop in the Coast Guard. It's his shop's responsibility to look at emerging trends around the world and to sort out what the implications of those trends are for the U.S. Coast Guard and to come up with policies to address those trends. Sam will talk with you about that. He also is able to focus like a laser on the legal implications of piracy and how those legal implications impact what can and cannot be done regarding piracy. Last is Captain retired Gordan Van Hook, just retired from the U.S. Navy after nearly 30 years, just 3 or 4 months ago. He has the perspective of a Navy practitioner, but now he works for Maersk Line Limited down in Washington, which is the world's largest shipping outfit. And now Gordan has responsibility for Maersk for looking at piracy and sorting out how Maersk might respond to it. So let's begin. I think Martin will be first, followed by Gordan Van Hook, and then Sam. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here, an honor and a privilege, in fact. And I'd like to thank Dr. Bird and Dr. Harris on behalf of myself and my colleagues for inviting us to address you on this pressing topic. Although it says in the program it's an irritating phenomenon. Let's pretend it's a pressing topic, shall we? We've all got a very short time to speak. My brief tonight is really to give you a very brief, fast overview of the phenomenon, which I think some of my colleagues might pick up some of these points, or we can talk about them later in the Q&A. I think the first point is very important to recognize and remember, is that piracy is a global phenomenon, but not a global problem. Attention is focused currently on Somalia, but piracy is still occurring elsewhere around the globe, in Bangladesh, in India, around parts of South America, in Southeast Asia, perhaps most worryingly off Nigeria. I mean, if we were having this meeting 3 years ago, we'd actually be talking about piracy of Malaysia and the Straits of Malacca. Now, everywhere it occurs, it is driven by local conditions and circumstances. What follows from that is that solutions need to be local. Well, clearly the most pressing issue is Somali piracy, and the distinguishing feature of Somali piracy is the fact that the pirates can access sanctuary. They can take and hold ships and crews for ransom with little fear of recapture or reprisal. No other modern piracy group has been able to do that. Now, the driving force of piracy is opportunity. And I would argue there are 6 factors that are always in play to one degree or another, and they sort of act and react one on another, and one has to look at the circumstances to see how they're playing. First of all is legal opening. We've clearly got the issue of how the law of the sea is applied on the high seas, but also how domestic law is applied within territorial waters. And clearly in the case of Somalia, there isn't a state, so there isn't anybody to enforce the law, which takes you on to the second point. You need a permissive political environment for piracy to take place. And poor security, and those two often go together, but not necessarily. You also need a maritime tradition. Piracy does not occur off the coast where there is very little, for example, fishing as something that the coastal people engage in. You need geography, which generally means narrow seas or choke points, and clearly you need the opportunity of reward. There's very little point paddling out onto the ocean if there's nothing to capture. So you need good, productive shipping lanes passing by your coast. Now, Somalia, in many ways, is the perfect storm. Somalian piracy has exploded because it can. Precisely why it exploded in 2005, to the degree that it did, remains a matter of conjecture. But what is clear is that the political elites on land, especially in Puntland, are benefiting. That said, I think we need to recognize the political circumstances that have persisted, that have existed in Somalia since 1991. Somalia is a ravaged country. It is fair to say that the dictator, Barre, who was in power from 1969 to 1991, left a legacy which bears comparison with Stalin's legacy to the Ukraine after the great induced famine of the 1930s. He deliberately rent the social fabric of his nation, setting clan against clan, expropriating industry, collectivizing agriculture, and ruining pastoralism, events which triggered famines that left hundreds of thousands dead and hundreds of thousands more homeless and migrants. The conflict that erupted subsequently, after he was disposed, when clan attacked clan, could be compared to the murderous ethnic conflict and ethnic cleansing that rent the Balkans following the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. We're dealing with a very sad situation. However, the characteristics of Somali piracy are not new. The first incident occurred in the Gulf of Aden, the first recorded incident, I should say, of piracy and kidnapping occurred in 1994. By 1998, 2/3 of all maritime kidnapping worldwide was occurring in the Gulf of Aden. And even then, there were 4 characteristics that were evident then, which are still evident today. First is kidnapping. At that stage, it was crews alone, and now we're seeing crews and ships kidnapping together. It just happens to be more convenient. You may as well take the crew's prison with them. Secondly, we already saw instances of motherships being used, that is to say larger ships which then deployed smaller ships to actually carry out the seizure. The issue of illegal fishing, claims the pirates were defending fishing grounds and fining offenders. 1994, that was being used then. And links to Somali elites and political figures. Now, these links are difficult to prove, but it's pretty clear that the wealth gets spread around. The president of Puntland, Yusuf, who's just been, was in 2004, became the president of the transitional federal government and has recently resigned. And the new president of Puntland, Farioli, probably we're taking about 20% of the income from piracy. And estimates are that Farioli, the new president, possibly earned as much, or has earned as much as $5 million over the last few years. So far, that is generally not an issue that's being confronted for various political reasons. The question is clearly, will we confront them about these issues? And even more importantly, so what if we do? Going on about the naval response. Questions have been raised about what navies are doing, how effective they're being. It's really pointless criticising navies and what they've managed to achieve because they are restricted by the rules of engagement. Rules of engagement derive from policy, political policy, and Somali piracy simply isn't a policy priority. They are, frankly, many demands on limited resources. These are also vast sea areas. Depending how you cut it, between 1 million and 2 million square miles is the, in fact, area of operations. There's a limited number of naval ships out there and virtually no air assets, and those assets, whether on the sea or on the air, are rotated regularly. Now, numbers count in these issues, and there could be anywhere between, difficult to say, but say between 60 and 120 pirate boats at sea at any one time. Now, these hide amongst the regular fishing boats, and identifying conclusively which are pirate boats and which are not demands inspection or demands that the naval ship is in the vicinity when the attack takes place. Once they're on board a ship that they capture, and they can be on board within 15 minutes, pirates have the initiative. It becomes a piracy situation, and one has to recognize that Somali pirates, compared to pirates elsewhere in the world, are relatively gentle with human life. There's been, on my count, there might be more, but on my count, probably 2 actual deaths, murderous deaths, violent deaths resulting from Somali piracy over 10 years, which is not the situation, not the history in Southeast Asia. So to conclude, from this very, very brief and very rapid overview, piracy, a global phenomenon, but not a global problem. Solutions are local to each case. There are 6 factors which appear to be present in one degree or another. Although piracy is manifested at sea, it is a land-based crime that demands land-based solutions. Solutions on water are not cost-effective and rarely successful. If we're going to address Somali piracy, we need to take action against those who benefit. Solutions need to be political, but if a state is established that is just strong enough to transform piracy transform Somalia from a failed state to a weak one, and therefore is strong enough to counter the problem of piracy. Let us not forget that could be ideal for insurgent groups to find shelter. Terrorists prefer weak states to failed states, and pirate sanctuary could be exchanged for insurgent sanctuary, and which is worse. Thank you.
Okay, I'd also like to thank Dr. Burt and Dr. Harris for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak from the industry perspective. It is a diverse lot, as you can imagine. So I'm giving you my point of view that also represents the point of view of my company. And is generally, I think, in line with what most folks feel in the maritime industry. As Robbie said, I do have a slightly different background than you'll find in most of the commercial maritime industry. I did serve in the U.S. Navy for 29 years. I do have the perspective of I was the 5th Fleet NAVCENT operations officer for 3 years, 1999 to 2001 in the region, and I deployed there frequently. My last time there was as the Sea Combat Commander for the Nimitz strike group in 2005. So I can tell you that this is not a new problem off of Somalia. It's been going on for years at varying levels of intensity, but it has definitely picked up in intensity in the last few years. My company, Maersk Line Limited, is a U.S. flag company. I just want to clarify that we operate 58 ships with U.S. flag. We're mainly hauling stuff for the U.S. government. So we are a subsidiary under the greater A.P. Moller Maersk, which are the big blue ships you'll see out there. There's 1,300 of them, by the way. We circle the globe 5 times daily. So as far as awareness of the maritime domain, I don't think you'll find another company that understands the environment that they're operating in too much better. As a point of reference, our company, Maersk Line Limited, U.S. flag, has about 250 transits a year of this particular body of water, the Gulf of Aden. Okay, so I've heard people say this is not a U.S. problem. Yeah, we do have U.S. flags operating in this area. We do have U.S. civilian mariners operating in this region. So we shouldn't minimize that. By comparison, A.P. Moller Maersk has 2,000 transits a year of the 20,000 total transits. So about 10% of the transits are A.P. Moller Maersk ships. So we are the largest transitor of this region. And as another point of reference, we've had 3 attacks, okay? 3 attacks on our ships of the 2,000 that are transiting. Okay, so I think Martin did a good job in setting the scene that this is a problem, but we have to keep it in perspective. It's a regional problem, okay? It is not a threat to the global economic system, okay? It's a threat to the global maritime commercial system in this region, in this one region. It is a threat, but it is not, I would not call it a systemic threat, a life-threatening threat. It is a threat to smaller vessels, okay? The smaller tramp vessels, the feeder vessels that operate in this region. There's no question. But for most of our ships, the large container ships that blow through there at 20 knots and have over 15 meters of freeboard, it's just not an issue, okay? But we have put certain guidance in place for our ships that if you can't make at least 15 knots and have 10 meters of freeboard, then you don't go through there, okay? That said, there's one exception. One of our vessels, the Maersk Arizona, operates a feeder run between Salalah in Oman to Djibouti, and she does that twice a week. So she's operating twice a week, going back and forth right in the high threat area, and she is U.S. flag and she has U.S. mariners. So I would say that we are concerned. We're concerned for our mariners. We're concerned for their safety. And we are taking certain measures for our ships that are operating in the region. Arizona typically operates in a convoy. And that convoy, you should be interested, could be Indians. It can be Russians that are convoying us. There are Chinese. There are all nations involved in this. And I think that's a good thing. Those of you that are familiar with the U.S. Navy's recent maritime strategy, it's called a cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power, and it places great emphasis on global maritime partnerships. Some of you have heard the term the 1,000-ship Navy. The 1,000-ship Navy is meant to be cooperation amongst all the world's navies to maintain the security of our global system. And I would like to forward that this is a test case for that strategy. It is a wonderful test case from which we can really validate such a strategy. From the industry perspective, we see several solutions to this, and most all of us agree to this. There have been a series of meetings at the Maritime Administration that have been open to industry, and industry has had plenty of opportunities to provide their opinions on this. First of all, like any bad neighborhood, we'd like to see more cops on the beat. There's no question that the increase in maritime power in the region is very much welcomed by industry. You're probably never going to hear anybody in industry say there's enough there. They're always going to say we'd like to see more there. Okay, so first and foremost, we'd like to see more assets there, both sea and air. As Martin correctly said, there's a dearth of air power in the region to provide that type of maritime patrol that you need for this size of an area. Next, we'd really like to see some sort of coordination and collaboration center within the region, a centralized place that we can call into to report our transit. Right now, we report to the UK MTO, the UK Maritime Transportation Office in Dubai, and that's fine. Dubai, those of you familiar with the geography, is kind of far away, and they do a great job. But we'd like to see something within the region there to both coordinate the passage of commercial vessels and the naval assets that are there. Some of you are familiar with what happened a few months ago with the Indian Navy ship Tabar, when she fired upon what she said was a mothership. Well, what it was a Thai fishing vessel that had been taken over by pirates and probably would become a mothership. But she went in guns a-blazing and killed 6 Thai fishermen. So let's think about what Martin said, the death rate so far to pirates, which are 2 that we know of, and I think one of those was even a heart attack, but and another was an accidental discharge. But that said, the greatest danger right now to seafarers in the region has been uncoordinated, unprepared naval power, okay? So those of us that have worn the uniform understand that there's nothing more dangerous in this world than an uncoordinated warship or a poorly led warship with poor intelligence and poor coordination. So if we're going to put maritime power in the region, most of us in industry would like to see some sort of coordination done with that. And we recognize that it's a coalition effort, that each of those navies have, as Martin correctly said, have different rules of engagement. They have different political guidance. Everybody understands that. But if there's a central place where they can all call into and talk, then it is far better. Now, the EU has set up a nice little coordination center called, I think it's MSC HOA, and there's a website. You can go check it out. It's actually very good. We like it. It has a lot of good information on it. It shows characteristic pirate vessels, what they look like, the normal suspects, compares a Somali skiff with a Yemeni fishing dhow, shows you what the difference is, which are the ones that you have to really watch out for. Gives a lot of good guidance on best practices. It's a wonderful website, and it's a good place to check out. However, most of your ships at sea, your commercial vessels, have very limited bandwidth. They have very limited commercial satellite capability. They can't get on and surf the web, if you understand that. So the EU Maritime Security Center, which is a good one, but it's located in Northwood in the UK. Okay, that's kind of far away, and it's not exactly what we'd like to see. The French in Djibouti did a lot of coordination, Al-Indien out of Djibouti, and they have been coordinating convoys and what are called group transits. A group transit is where they place maritime assets, every, they try, 40 or 50 miles along this transit route. and provide some sort of security. Okay, thirdly, industry recognizes that we have to harden ourselves, we have to do things, we have a responsibility, we understand that. There are things that we need to do in how we operate. We have to, as I said, we try to operate our high freeboard, high-speed assets through this region. And we understand that. There's basic evasive techniques that we can take. If they do approach you, you put on speed, you use evasive maneuvers, and you can avoid a lot of the trouble. The biggest threat is usually a poor watch. You know, if you're not keeping track or you're not aware of your surroundings, then these guys come up behind you, and before you know it, they're on board. It's all over. As Martin said, it's a 15-minute game, and our commercial mariners are not set up to resist in any way, and we do not advise them to resist. The Maersk Arizona has what's called a safe room down in its after steering, where they can actually all go down and they can steer the ship and they can hold out for a few hours if they had to. So we do take certain measures. We do not, our company, AP Moller Maersk and Maersk Line Limited, does not support having armed security on board. We do not believe that that's the right way to go. There's a number of legal and liability issues with that. Many of the flag states that we use, other than our U.S. flagships, will forbid the use of arms on board. You have to remember the liability. This area is full of fishermen, and a lot of these fishermen are armed. And it's hard to tell who is a pirate and who is a fisherman. The fishermen don't want to be taken by the pirates either, so they arm themselves. It's a very fuzzy area. We've had a number of times where ships out there have said that they're being shadowed, they're being harassed, and when it was gone over afterwards, it looked like, well, these were just fishermen that were transiting in the area, and the crew was frightened. And there's been other examples where ships have said they're under attack. They've drawn naval assets off toward them, and lo and behold, an attack happens where those naval assets had been previously. So there's a lot of issues there. We use security on board a number of our vessels. We use Gurkhas with British non-coms, ex-non-coms. They're unarmed. We use them in our Africa feeder vessels, our vessels that go to Africa mainly to prevent stowaways. If we have a stowaway on board, it is a failure of our security system, and that leads to higher insurance rates. So that's what we're more concerned about. So we will use unarmed security, but not armed security. And lastly, I'd like to say that most people in the industry understand this region. They know that the problems are shore, just as Martin went over very clearly. It's a long-term problem. It's going to require a long-term solution, hopefully an international solution, a multilateral approach that uses all elements of national and international power, because I think we all understand that a failed state like Somalia it can be a threat, much as Afghanistan was, and we've justified our involvement in Afghanistan based on it being a failed state and it being a sanctuary for terrorists. Somalia could develop the same way. So it is a problem. It does need to be dealt with. We can't just hope it goes away. I think most all people in the industry understand that it's going to require a thorough multilateral approach. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks also again to Dr. Bird and Dr. Harris, and thank you all for the warm welcome tonight. I mentioned to a few of you looking out over the harbor that I had the privilege of commanding the Coast Guard cutter Red Birch in Curtis Bay, Maryland, from 1990 to 1992. And so it's a pleasure to look out over the harbor and remember all those, remember very well, because I worked all the aids navigation in this area for 2 years. So thanks for welcoming me back, and it's nice to be here. Martin provided excellent context for piracy today, and I would draw attention particularly to his point that this is inherently a land-based problem that is projecting itself on the sea, and thus there are limits to what naval forces can do in this situation without the solution on land. Gordan followed with a great sense of the significance and impact of this on merchant shipping, and I would draw attention to his observation that it's awfully nice to have a few more cops in the area regardless of that land-based problem. And so apropos of the theater and of the table here, the maritime services are in between those two positions, recognizing there are limits to what we can do in the area, but wanting to make a contribution to the maritime security in that area. And so I'll conclude my remarks and open up to questions by looking at this, what we're doing actively right now as maritime services in the area, with a particular attention to Somalia and apprehending the pirates and their subsequent prosecution. U.S. policy on piracy was recently updated in October of, or correction, in June of 2007, and understandably, it recognizes the threat and is committed to an international cooperation to repress piracy. The U.S. plan, the action plan, is a plan called a Partnership and Action Plan for countering piracy off the Horn of Africa, was just completed in December, and once again commits us to collaborative international action. And that's the first point I'd like to say, is that U.S. policy is very much collaborative in this. It's not a go-it-alone situation. I think Gordan has well sort of laid down that framework, but we're working very closely with navies around the world in this area. That plan, the partnership plan and action plan that came out in December, has 3 lines of action, and they'll be my framework for a very brief presentation here about what's going on off the coast of Somalia. Those 3 lines of action, the first is a logical extension of what Gordan just mentioned, which is preventing piracy attacks and reducing vulnerability. And I think Gordan handled it very well. The vulnerability here is on the low and the slow. Less than about 20-25 feet of freeboard, slower than about 15 knots. This is a business proposition for pirates. They are preying on the easiest vessels that they can capture. And so Gordan touched on such things as evasive maneuvers, vessel design modifications like wire and netting and electric fence, and the various things that industry are doing. These things have an effect, and also industry policy, as he's talked about the vessels going through the area. So a lot of work is being done in this area, and I think to good effect to deter and make it more difficult to do this. First line of action. Second line of action is responding and interrupting and terminating pirate attacks. And I'd like to give you a sense of what's happened in the last 6 months, because I think it's significant in terms of international engagement. In August of 2008, U.S. Central Command, and I'll talk about the U.S. actions first, U.S. Central Command, their naval component, or NAVCENT, established a maritime security patrol area. This is a standard route for ship routing that I think Gordan discussed. And in January of 2009, NAVCENT stood up Coalition Task Force 151. This task force is a coalition task force. It's a multinational task force of naval vessels focused solely on the piracy problem off the Horn of Africa. It's separate from other task forces that are dealing with other national security problems in that area, as we know there are many. This focuses, it's a law enforcement mission, so they're geared up in their focus entirely on a law enforcement mission, collaborative international focusing forces in that area. That command is in Bahrain. Forces in theater, I checked this week, you have U.S. flag vessels, warships, UK, Danish, and they were joined this week, I think, by a Turkish ship. A Turkish warship joined that. It's with this group that the Coast Guard is deploying law enforcement teams that are riding on the U.S. Navy ships and using the skills that we've honed in the drug war to help do these boardings with an aim towards eventual prosecution of these cases, evidence collection, forensics, and things like that. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So there's these U.S. forces out there. Gordan touched on the European Union's presence. This is the Maritime Security Center, Horn of Africa, that he mentioned, the one that's being commanded out of Northwood in the UK. Since December of 2007, this is recent stuff, since December of 2007, they have had a task force in the area. Checking on that, that naval task force currently has Greek, German, French, again UK, and Spanish warships attached to it. So this is the second body of naval forces that's working there. And as Gordan also mentioned, there are other warships from India, from China, from Russia, and from other countries also engaged independently on behalf of their countries operating in the area. I think the total forces there right now, when I checked this week, is about 24 warships operating in the area to provide security. And if you caught the dates, this is really ramped up since about December of this year. That said, the operational problem, and I am not from NAVCENT, so I can't speak to this other than what I know generally, but the operational problem is not insignificant. It's one of detection. There are many fishing vessels operating in the area, limited radar return on these small vessels. First indication you may have of a closing vessel that's trying to board you may be visual and not radar at all. You only have about 15 to 30 minutes in order to take evasive action or to get an intercept of an aircraft or a naval vessel in the area. The sea is still very large and very anonymous, and I want to just re-emphasize that for all of our technology and for all of our capabilities, it is a large ocean out there, and these problems are challenging, as we know in the drug problem in the transit corridor here in the U.S. This just illustrates it as well. So that's an operational overview. I want to talk just briefly about the legal frameworks in prosecuting pirates. So if you apprehend and interdict, what do you do with them? Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I think I've got a pretty good background, and I think this is interesting. I think you'll appreciate sort of the legal context of this, because it is as old as the millennia. This is an original crime, probably as old as men going or ships going to sea in the first place. It is, I'm told, the first extraterritorial universal crime. Under the law of the sea, the 1958 convention, and that we are signatory to, as well as the 82 convention that we follow. This is an international universal crime. And by that I mean, and I am told, assured by our lawyers, any nation can take legal action against piracy. Any nation can take legal action against piracy. What you need are the domestic laws under your national framework to prosecute successfully that piracy, and you need the willingness and the national interest to engage and do it. So the first thing I'd like to overlay is that piracy is a long-standing universal crime, but it has 4 elements. It's violence or a depredation against ships on the high seas launched from another ship. And the final one is that it's done for gain, for profit. These are the elements, the criminal elements, if you're a lawyer, and I'm sure there are in the room. And I point that out because there's a second legal framework that I think you might be interested that applies here. If you'll recall, in 1985, there was a passenger vessel off the coast of Egypt called the Achille Lauro. And an American citizen was murdered on that ship, Leon Klinghoffer, I believe was the name. That case revealed a gap in international law, because if you'll recognize right away, the elements of from the sea, from another ship didn't happen because the perpetrators were on board the ship, and it was arguably for political ends and not profit. That gap was closed in 1988 by a United Nations convention called the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts at Sea Against Navigation, I think is the full title, SUA, S-U-A. And that legal framework is an overlapping framework. It's an overlapping framework to the law of the sea. It provides greater detail and mechanisms, and there's about 150 nations that have signed that agreement, and they have committed to accept prisoners that are delivered to them by either ship captains or in the Navy, and then either to extradite them to nations that will try them or try them for these crimes. Now, in order to do that, this follows my first observation about the law of the sea, you have to have domestic law then to do that. You can sign an agreement internationally, but then you need to implement it domestically. And this takes me to the third area I'd like to discuss, which is very recent, which is the domestic implementation of these laws in that region. Middle January, around January 16th, the United States signed a memorandum of agreement or a memorandum of understanding with Kenya. And what that does is it folds underneath of this international legal framework, and the Kenyans sort of set out the framework with which they will take the pirates in and either extradite them to a nation that will try them or try them there, and what their terms of evidence are. And I think this is very important. So we have this accord that went on, and just 3 weeks ago, actually end of January, so it's a month ago, there was an agreement, not a legal framework, but an agreement reached in Djibouti called the Djibouti Code of Conduct. 21 nations were there, 9 of them signed it immediately. They're all the nations that I think really matter. It's Somalia, it's Kenya, it's Tanzania, it's the Seychelles, it's Yemen, it's the ones that are in the immediate area that set out a framework in a number of areas for ship riders as well as for examining their domestic law to be able to prosecute piracy. So a lot of activity downrange by the lawyers in the last couple months in sort of arranging the frameworks to be able to address piracy. And if you've watched the news in the last couple of weeks, U.S. warship, the Vela Gulf, I think, actually captured and delivered to Kenya some pirates under this framework. So I think I've kind of walked you through a little bit, and I thought that was interesting to sort of lay down the legal framework that we're working in there in this area. I'll end right there because I want to make sure there's time for discussion. I'll put a little bit of a commercial on the end here for the Coast Guard and why we're involved. I mentioned that we have law enforcement teams, detachments on the naval vessels. This is our area of expertise and work, honed by years in the drug trade. These leadettes are very experienced in evidence collection. They launch with an eye on the end game of successful prosecution in a court of law. And that governs your actions. If you, as law enforcement officers, you know, that governs your actions in every step of an evolution. We do training on board the naval vessels. We work on the evidence collection. So we're a part of the boarding parties aboard the naval vessels. And our lawyers are also very involved with Navy lawyers in setting up these frameworks and being engaged. So it's a good partnership there. Within the limitations that both Martin and Gordan have laid out, the inherent, tactical problems of working in that area. But that's our role, and I'll conclude by observing, as Martin did, that the solution to this is going to be ashore. Somalia is so unique. It's just a complete and utterly failed state that's creating this situation of haven that was pointed out. So I'll conclude there, and I believe we're open for your questions.
Oh, okay, I'll repeat the question. It had to do with decoy ships and additional security that we could invest in, whether they be private contractors. I think that was the nature of the question. First of all, there's been a proliferation, as you can imagine, of firms that are hiring former special operators, and they are peddling their wares out there. I've had quite a few of them come and see me and tell me about the services that they could render. There's several different plans for private security vessels that would supplement the naval forces there. The company Blackwater, that most of you are familiar with, has a vessel called the MacArthur. And the last report I had, she was headed to the region. She's on her way out there without a contract. Okay? So while I, as a former naval officer, I'm in with your spirit and your admiration for Stephen Decatur, companies are not going to make that investment for a number of reasons. It's just not cost effective. It just, as I said, we've had 3 ships attacked out of thousands of transits, and it's just not. We feel we can make changes in our operating patterns, minimize our risk. We're not going to pay private security to do that. There's a liability issue there. Some of you that may be maritime lawyers know that when a vessel responds to a plea for help, that vessel that responds has a claim on that vessel, has a salvage claim, okay? So that's why we're a little bit nervous when we see the MacArthur on its way out there without a contract. So we're going to be very circumspect before we ask them for help, because they could justify the cost of their whole operation very quickly with just one vessel. So it's a complicated matter. We are all for armed security when they are armed sailors, when they are military. We do have armed sailors on board some of our MSC ships when we operate in certain regions. That's fine for us. We're just not, we don't want to arm our mariners who are not really trained or prepared for that, and then they incur a liability that we don't want to subject them to. The captain, the master of that vessel is then liable if they shoot a fisherman. So obviously that's not a risk that they'd like to take. And so really it comes down to it's cost effective. I've thought about the same thing. I mean, why not have a Q ship or something, that comes in there? But it's an investment, and it is not cheap to operate one of these vessels, and or to man it with highly trained security people.
That was a question about is it possible to tie piracy and international terrorism together, and if so, what the legal effects will be. Sam will address the legal effects. Let me just address the political issue. There has been no evidence, no conclusive evidence, that there's been any terrorist involvement in piracy anywhere. There's been various stories. The most high-profile concerned a ship called the Dewey Madrim, which was out in just off the Straits of Malacca, in Southeast Asia anyway, which was a small gas carrier. And the report that went around the world, which was partly carried in an article in Foreign Affairs, was that this ship was taken over by terrorists who were maneuvering the ship to learn its characteristics, and that such a ship could then be driven into a harbour and exploded. Most ships, once you know the characteristic of one ship, you don't necessarily know the characteristic of the second ship. That's the first point. And secondly, the master and the owners of that particular ship denied the story categorically. We're not entirely sure where that came from. So there's no provable connection between terrorists and pirates. There's no conceivable, well, not conceivable is conceivable, but there's no real reason why terrorists, if they wish to use maritime assets destructively, would go to pirates to learn their trade. They could frankly go to retired naval personnel. They'd probably get a much better idea of what to do. And pirates, being criminals, probably wouldn't want to sully their own backyard. Certainly that would be true in Southeast Asia. So there is no real connection. There has been some suggestion, clearly, that terrorists and insurgent groups have, if you like, used pirate tactics themselves to intercept ships. We believe that's happened at the northern end of the Malacca Straits, that the LTTE off Sri Lanka have used similar tactics, and it's clearly happened quite regularly in the waters off the southern Philippines, but not in the circumstances that you're proposing.
I'll just add on that briefly. It's a very good question, and I think a logical one to put forward. As Martin says, has well summarized that the connection has not been found to be there yet. From an operational perspective, I think that question illustrates the inherent challenges in the maritime of dealing with the maritime as a vector for terrorism, which is to say, the terrorists are going to use legitimate domestic traffic as their means to affect action. So you tend to, absent intelligence, you enter almost every situation as a law enforcement within the rule of law. This is, when we go through these fishing fleets off of Somalia, there's vessels everywhere. And should they? And how does that transpire? I don't know that ahead of the actual engagement and finding out through biometrics or evidence collection some connection, you would have any indication that would change sort of your operational status. And I think what I'm taking from your question is, could we go in a more forceful way, or a more, if we knew that? Absent intelligence about the situation, we're going to approach it just as we do in the U.S. Waters. It's maritime commerce, and therein lies the challenge, sir.
The question is there a difference in policy between U.S. flag and foreign shipping companies in paying ransom if your ship is taken? It's a very good question, because I think there is, and maybe Sam can help me with this, but I think there is legislation that prevents paying ransom, U.S. companies paying ransom to a terrorist organization, but these are not terrorists. So we've asked this question, actually, because we've done a tabletop exercise because we're concerned if we did have a U.S. flag taken, what would be our options? And it's a bit of a murky legal area, actually. And we cannot find anything that says we legally cannot pay a ransom. I'm sure it's probably discouraged, but I haven't seen policy on it unless Sam has. So generally, the practice, if the ship is taken, we have a private security firm that actually has hostage negotiators that would negotiate with these guys and try to get them freed. That's our course of action right now until we get told otherwise. What is the threat to the cruise industry? I only have a limited exposure to this, but they are considerably faster. They do have a high freeboard. They do have a greater risk to their passengers, and there have been some companies that have chosen to divert. I can't remember the name of the company, but there was one, the more famous one, that recently decided, and with the low price of fuel and frankly the high canal cost, the Suez Canal, I'll just say that's for most folks in industry in this region, that's their top concern, are the high costs of transiting the Suez Canal, which has gotten up to $200,000 or $300,000 a transit for a medium-sized tanker. And that is having more of an effect on maritime trade through the region than piracy, frankly, and has the low cost of oil. Okay, Robbie pointed out I should explain freeboard. Freeboard is the distance from the water line to the main deck, okay? So obviously if you have 15, 20, 30 meters of freeboard, that's a pretty tough scale for these guys that are in little skiffs, and it's rough out there, and they have to basically get a ladder up there and a grappling hook and get themselves up there. So if you have a high freeboard and high speed, you're definitely safer. The question was, can you address the pirate situation around Nigeria? I think maybe Martin might have more background. I have a little bit on it.
Okay, I'll do my best. I'm a little bit off the pace on Nigeria. Piracy incidents per se off Nigeria, it's not a substantial problem. But there's been a lot of attacks on shipping in coastal waters and on rivers related to a variety of politico-criminal groups, of which the best known is MEND. What MEND is exactly remains a matter of some conjecture. Certainly the situation in the Niger Delta is volatile and difficult. There has been some improvement recently because the man who was regarded as the leader of MEND was captured some months ago. I believe he was captured in Angola, and there's been some effect on maritime crime in the region. That said, looking at MEND from its political aspects rather than necessarily its pure piracy aspects, MEND is a pretty formidable opponent and has demonstrated some very interesting capabilities. It has attacked a offshore platform about 60 to 70 miles off the Nigerian coast with a multi-ship attack, which shows a degree of coordination, navigation ability, and planning ability. And there's also been rumours that they have made landings and attacks in Cameroon, and they've looked at attacks further afield. So they are a group with considerable capability, one to be watched. But pure piracy, they haven't indulged in to any great extent.
I'd add a few things onto that. The question, and it's a very useful question because in the news, and piracy becomes, it's Straits of Malacca and the Gulf of Guinea and Somalia. It's interesting to distinguish the differences between the Gulf of Guinea and Somalia. In the Gulf of Guinea, it's violent. It's crimes against individual, whereas, as Martin pointed out, in Somalia, the individuals are of value and they're held hostage, and so it's a much more violent crime going on in the Gulf of Guinea. In many cases, a lot of what happens is actually within the territorial seas, so I could be very technical and say this is crime at sea but doesn't constitute piracy, as it doesn't make the high seas, as well as its political orientation. The other difference in the lenses as we look at these two things, that there are sovereign coastal states in the Gulf of Guinea that while they may not have fully developed, they may have capacity issues in their judicial system or capacity issues to get out at sea and patrol their waters. There are governments there. There's absolutely nothing in place in Somalia, and so these are the big bright differences between the two places. I just end that the problem in the Gulf of Guinea, the U.S. Navy and AFRICOM have an ongoing and fairly large program called Africa Partnership Station, working in the Gulf of Guinea on these capacity building issues, working with the navies and the Coast Guards in the area. The Coast Guard cutter Dallas recently deployed to that area and conducted training with the local Coast Guards in the African nations, trying to build up the capacity to govern their coastal waters. So it's all a part of a national effort there. But just want to draw the distinction between those two areas because it's a really great question. If the headline flashes on piracy, there's some differences in what's going on around the world, and some of it is more crime. And as Martin sort of alludes, where does piracy become just an insurgency and a political terrorism such as LTTE? We'll stop there.
It's been a most informative evening, gentlemen, and we deeply appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us. Thanks so much.